What up, though? I was thinking, uh, on the west side of Chicago, when I was coming up, I saw people getting lynched. And just so you know, the people you term white people wasn't around. I ain't discovered the people you term white people until I started going to school. The people you term black Americans and or African Americans, properly Americans, was the Lynch Mob. The gangs in Chicago, or as we call them, mobs, were lynching each other and regular schmegular degular people. It was guns, but I mostly remember hood justice being served with baseball bats and beatings. In today's news, today's narrative, and the narrative that's plagued my mind for years is that pink and gray people, who you term white people, had a monopoly on lynching. And let's be honest, lynching is a group of men mainly handling their business on individuals or groups of individuals that violated, and in turn, those individuals or groups were under violation. Violations in my neighborhood included beatings with hands and feet, beatings with bats, or getting shot in your arms or legs, or getting beaten to where you would have to be carried home, like I've seen. Lynching, to my understanding, means mob justice without the luxury of a trial. By this understanding, I've been lynched and have lynched a few people, all of which include myself, are what you term black Americans and or African Americans, properly Americans, and was lynched by what you term black Americans and or African Americans, properly Americans. If I'm not mistaken, it was the early 90s when I was made privy to the Willie Lynch letter. The Willie Lynch letter at the time justified what I was indoctrinated to believe, what my ancestors were up against. Although the letter reminded me of the sardine can slave ship propaganda, and I assumed it was legit, and later thought it had been dropped from an airplane directly in my neighborhood, I picked it up, read it. It seemed like propaganda, actually directions, not just for the so-called slaveholder, but for the slave as well. It seemed as though a large number of the people in my neighborhood were following the directives in the letter. Ferris State University. Is Willie Lynch's letter real? May 2004. Is Willie Lynch's letter real? If it is real, it is one of the most important documents related to African Americans. Gloria Jenkins, Big Sandy, Texas. There are many problems with this document, not the least of which is the fact that it is absolutely fake. This is from www.ferris.edu. In the few years since the speech on how to train slaves first appeared, it has been cited by countless college students and a black member of the House of Representatives, along the way becoming the essential verbal footnote in barbershop analysis of what's wrong with black people. The rapper Talib Kweli laments on the song Know That Blacks Are Dying. How to Make a Slave by Willie Lynch is still applying. And one professor at a Midwestern university made the speech required reading for her class. According to the speech's preface, Master Lynch was concerned enough with the fortunes of his slave-holding brethren in the American colonies to present a lecture on the bank of the James River, explaining how to keep unruly servants disunited. The old, he argued, should be pitted against the young, the dark against the light, the male against the female, and so on. Such disunifying tactics will control the slaves for at least 300 years, he guaranteed. And that, it seems, is why black people can't get ahead now. Slavery was an incredibly complex set of social, economic, and legal relations that literally boiled down to black and white. But given the variation in size of farms, number of enslaved workers, region, crops grown, law, gender ratios, religion, and local economy. Considering the limited number of extant sources from 18th century, if this speech had been discovered, it would have been the subject of incessant historical panels, scholarly articles, and debates. It would literally be a career-making find, but the letter was never discovered. Rather, it simply appeared on the internet, bypassing the official historical circuits and making its way directly into the canon of American racial conspiratoria. Lynch makes reference to an invitation reaching him on his modest plantation in the West Indies. While this is theoretically possible, the plantation system was well established in the Caribbean by 1712. Most plantation owners were absentees who chose to remain in the colonizing country, while the day-to-day affairs of their holdings were run by hired managers and overseers. Lynch makes consistent reference to slaves, which again is possible, though it is far more likely people during this era would refer to persons in bondage simply as Negroes. In the first paragraph, he promises that ancient Rome would envy us if my program is implemented. But the word program did not enter the English language with this connotation until 1837. 2 paragraphs later, he says that he will give an outline of action for slaveholders. The word outline had appeared only 50 years earlier, and at the time was only used as an artistic term, meaning a sketch. Even more damning is his use of the terms indoctrination and self-refueling in the next sentence. The first word didn't carry its current connotation until 1832. The second didn't even enter the language until 1811, a century after the purported date of Lynch's speech. More obviously, Lynch uses the word black with an uppercase B to describe African Americans more than 2 centuries before the word came to be applied as a common ethnic identifier. In some popular citations, Lynch has also been inexplicably credited with the term lynching, which would be odd since the speech promises to provide slaveholders with nonviolent techniques that will save them the expense of killing valuable, if unruly, property. Early America was incredibly violent in general. For most of its history, lynching was a non-racial phenomenon. In fact, it most often directed at white people. The term lynch law was derived from the mob violence directed at Tories or British loyalists just after the American Revolution. There is no reference to the term earlier than 1768, more than half a century after the date given for the speech. Lynching was often seen as a form of community justice. Not until the 1880s, after the end of Reconstruction, did lynching become associated with African Americans. Gradually, the number of blacks lynched each year surpassed the number of whites until it became almost exclusively directed at black people late in the century. Between 1882 and 1944, Tuskegee University recorded 3,417 lynchings with black victims and 1,291 lynchings with white ones. OxfordLearnersDictionaries.com, the online version. Lynch. Lynch somebody if a crowd of people lynch somebody whom they consider guilty of a crime. They capture them, do not allow them to have a trial in court, and kill them illegally. Mid-19th century from Lynch's Law, named after Captain William Lynch, head of a self-constituted judicial tribunal in Virginia, circa 1780. Montgomery Advertiser. Lynching legacy. There will be lynchings. How the advertiser failed victims of racial terror. Brian Lyman, Montgomery Advertiser, 2018. On September 29, 1919, a Montgomery mob kidnapped Miles Aurelius Pfeiffer and Robert Krosky as they were being transported to jail over allegations they assaulted two white women in separate incidents. The masked group drove the two men, both veterans, to some woods near Hughes Ferry Road and told them to run. They then shot them multiple times. Pfeiffer, reported to be wearing a U.S. Army uniform, was killed on the spot. Krosky later died at a hospital. Early the next morning, a band of white men broke into a Montgomery hospital where Will Temple, accused of killing a Montgomery police officer, was being treated for a head wound. The mob overpowered two policemen on duty, then shot Temple to death in his hospital ward. The Montgomery Advertiser's prescription for the outbreak of violence, in an October 1st editorial headline, "Steady," was nothing. All right-thinking people deplore lynchings, but it is wise to utter a solemn truth, which the old lesson brought home again. As long as there are attempts at rape by black men, red men, or yellow men on white women, there will be lynchings, the editorial said. Lynchings will end in America when there are no longer attempts at assault. The editorial claimed that the white people of the city would not tolerate blind or wholesale violence on the innocent and often helpless Negroes. The editorial claimed that the white people of the city would not tolerate blind or wholesale violence on the innocent and often helpless Negroes. The newspaper opposed the racially motivated murders of hundreds of black Alabamians during that time, with an editorial on May 1st, 1883, calling lynchings a cause of shame and a disgrace upon our people and our state. It is but slight palliation of all these crimes that the victims were themselves criminals of the worst character, the advertiser wrote. A February 18th, 1896 piece following the lynching of Robert Williams over the alleged shooting of a Montgomery police officer called the lynching unfortunate. In the same issue, the newspaper favorably quoted a sermon condemning the lynching, which included the line, "The crimes by Negroes chiefly provocative of lynching are growing more frequent, and lynchings of Negroes correspondingly more numerous." The news columns were, "When a crowd of whites killed Riley Webb in Selma in 1892, the opening sentence yelled with glee, 'He has been caught.'" The assumption that lynching victims were guilty impacted what few proposals the advertiser advanced to address the issue. Just before the Williams lynching in 1896, the editorial board picked up the report of a lynching of a white man in Illinois and whined that the Chicago Tribune, one of the few white newspapers at the time to compile lists of lynching victims, might not cover it. Just before the Williams lynching in 1896, the editorial board picked up the report of a lynching of a white man in Illinois and whined that the Chicago Tribune, one of the few white newspapers at the time to compile lists of lynching victims, might not cover it. If the same thing had been done in Alabama and a Negro had been the victim, scareheads and double leads would have been used in presenting its vituperation to the public, the paper wrote. On October 1st, 1897, the advertiser lashed out at a Boston newspaper for denunciations of a whole section for the occasional lynching of Negroes in the South for criminal assault on defenseless and helpless white women. If those who thus executed judgment had been Southern men, the deed would have been heralded as a natural result of Southern manners. But these men were from the very shadow of Plymouth Rock, and some of them may have descended from the innumerable Mayflower cargo, the advertiser wrote, adding, "It is not probable that the deed will excite much comment in the columns of the Northern newspapers." The advertiser was not alone among contemporary media outlets in its callous attitude toward lynching. But callousness was not the only attitude, and other reporters exposed the crimes. Journalist Ida B. Wells, a black woman, investigated and publicized lynchings in groundbreaking newspaper articles, books, and pamphlets, while putting herself at considerable personal risk. In 1905, Ray Stannard Baker published a long piece on lynching in McClure's. In no cases that I know of, either South or North, has a mob been made up of what may be called the best citizens. But the best citizens have often stood afar off, decrying the mob, as a Springfield man told me piously, and letting it go on, Baker wrote. The San Diego Voice and Viewpoint. For years, newspapers printed hate leading to lynchings and massacres of black Americans. By Deneen L. Brown, the Howard Center for Investigative Journalism. Fried over slow fire, Negro commits the unspeakable crime and is put to death with horrible torture. Mob gloats over fiendish barbarity. Herald, Democrat, Sherman, Texas, May 23rd, 1902. lynching caused by brutal murder. The Times and Democrat. Orangeburg, South Carolina, July 14, 1914. Negro under sentence to hang lynched at Tallahassee. The Pensacola Journal, Pensacola, Florida, June 8, 1909. Bloody work of mob. The Choctaw Plain Dealer, Ackerman, Mississippi, August 12, 1910. Governor Brow fired upon by Negroes at Elaine. Negroes had plot to rise against whites, charged. Arkansas Democrat, Little Rock, Arkansas, October 2, 1919. The assault on women avenged. Davis dragged from jail and lynched. Mob riddled Negro ravisher with bullets. Hung to tree on Brickyard Hill at early hour this morning. Brute confessed before the crowd, said he intended to murder her as well. Evening Capital, Annapolis, Maryland, December 21, 1906. 3,000 will burn Negro. The New Orleans States, New Orleans, Louisiana, June 26, 1919. Nab Negro for attacking girl in an elevator. The Tulsa Tribune, Tulsa, Oklahoma, May 31, 1921. Nab Negro for attacking girl in an elevator. The Tulsa Tribune, Tulsa, Oklahoma, May 31, 1921. Most of y'all wouldn't even think elevators existed in 1921. Don't be lazy. Go look it up. Let's shake it. John Hartfield will be lynched by Ellisville mob at 5 o'clock this afternoon. John Hartfield will be lynched by Ellisville mob at 5 o'clock this afternoon. Jackson Daily News, Jackson, Mississippi, June 26, 1919. Ellisville, Mississippi. Ellisville. Remember that. Fix for a barbecue. Preparations to roast Jim Buchanan, Negro murderer. Had the mob secured him at Nacogdoches, this was to have been the program. The Southern Mercury, Dallas, Texas, October 16, 1902. These racist terror lynchings defined as extrajudicial killings carried out by lawless mobs intending to terrorize black communities evoked horror, as victims were often castrated, dismembered, tortured, and riddled with bullets before being hanged from trees, light poles, and bridges. The project investigates the cumulative effect of how newspaper headlines and editorials incited racist terror and falsely accused black people of crimes. Where's your sources that they were falsely accusing them? I'm not saying I believe or not believe, but where are your sources? That's a huge claim to make, that they were falsely accusing somebody. Not that people don't falsely accuse people. But I mean, this is their burden. This is the Montgomery Advertiser's burden to show us that he was falsely accused. The series uncovers the widespread practice of publishing headlines that accelerated lynchings and massacres. That included newspapers announcing Negro uprisings, publishing uncorroborated stories of black men accused of assaulting white women, and printing allegations of arson and vagrancy. The newspaper examined in this project ran headlines calling black people brutes, fiends, and bad Negroes. Dope fiend, Joe dope fiend, Let's shake it. Many of those reporters failed to identify white people in the mob. Many of those reporters failed to identify white people in the mob. They also failed to hold government officials accountable by asking hard questions of the sheriff, judges, and other local law enforcement officials. The lynchings were covered as an everyday occurrence, often reported side by side with who graduated from college that day and stock prices. A reader could open the newspaper in the morning and casually scan the headlines reporting baseball scores, finalists in beauty contests, reports on tariff negotiations, and a news story advocating lynchings. I don't want to sway y'all one way or the other. But when they say you can open up a newspaper at that particular time and see the variety of these stories, you can open up any news website or any newspaper and you'll see the same variety today. If you want to know what was happening yesterday, look at today. Let's shake it. The series of stories in Printing Hate resulted from a multifaceted investigation by 58 student journalists from the University of Maryland, the University of Arkansas, and 5 historically black colleges and universities: Hampton University, Howard University, Morehouse College, Morgan State University, and North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University. The series showcases compelling narratives of those impacted by newspaper accounts, including the 1908 case of Annie Walker, who begged night riders for mercy before she was killed, according to a report in the Public Ledger newspaper in Kentucky. The Atlanta Journal wrote an editorial in 1906 in support of the legal disenfranchisement of 223,000 male Negroes of voting age in Georgia. The journal claimed to support the disenfranchisement of black men because we are the superior race and do not intend to be ruled by our semi-barbaric inferiors. The Atlanta Journal Constitution. The New York Times. When Southern Newspapers Justified Lynching, by Brent Staples, 2018. Among those in attendance was a reporter for the Memphis Press, whose story, under the headline "Kill Negro by Inches," validated the barbaric proceedings and cataloged the victim's suffering in lurid detail, noting that Lowry remained stoically silent even after the flesh had dropped away from his legs and the flames were leaping toward his face. Lowry had been charged with a wanton act of murder for killing his white landlord and the landlord's adult daughter. He had been charged with a wanton act of murder. Please look up wanton. I've looked it up before, but I don't remember the definition. But look up wanton act of murder for killing his white landlord and the landlord's adult daughter. Newspapers even bragged about the roles they had played in arranging particularly spectacular lynchings. Workaday stories that justified lynching by casting its victims as fiends, brutes, born criminals, or that catch-all favorite, troublesome Negroes. That description applies broadly to the Jim Crow era South, where even newspapers that were viewed as liberal replicated the apartheid state within their pages. That description applies broadly to the Jim Crow era South, where even newspapers that were viewed as liberal replicated the apartheid state within their pages. The Montgomery Advertiser, known in the 19th century as the leading paper of the Confederacy, put itself on the wrong side of history in countless ways, not least by ridiculing the civil rights movement that was launched by the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 and reached its zenith a decade later with the march from Selma to Montgomery and the passage of the Voting Rights Act. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Georgia lynch mobs devise flimsy reasons for taking lives. By Rosalind Bentley, The Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Wait a minute, didn't we just read some about the Atlanta Journal-Constitution? Ernie Suggs, The Atlanta Journal-Constitution. www.ajc.com. There was John Moody, a farmhand who in 1901 decided to leave his white employer in Bryan County to work for another white farmer. According to newspaper accounts from the time, the first employer, incensed, gathered a group of white caps, a precursor of the Ku Klux Klan, captured Moody, shot him, and then hanged him. It was a form of labor control. Labor, laborer, worker, employee, slave. What is this? Let's hurry up and get past this disgusting piece of art put in the center of a town so you can see and it can think for you and you can lick it in the mouth. There was the case of Jesse Statter, also known as Jesse Slater, who was accused of writing an insolent letter to a white woman and was lynched by a mob in November 19th. What did that letter say? Sisters Eula and Ella Barber were shot to death by a throng of 100 people in Jasper County in January 1915. They, along with their father Daniel and brother Jesse, were accused of challenging a sheriff who'd come to their juke joint. They probably challenged them. They probably challenged is a nice way of putting it. Nice meaning foolish. You know, it's one of the definitions, but I'm sure they challenged them. Let's shake it. It's not the method in which a person is killed. That context is when the person is summarily, lethally, and brutally punished for an alleged crime and denied due process of law. That cocktail of things is what we call a lynching. Sim Paget was accused of helping a friend accused of assaulting a white woman. A mob came to Paget's house demanding that he surrender. When he refused, they opened fire on his house. Paget shot back. In the shootout, Paget was killed, but so was his 10-year-old daughter, Doja. This is from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Sealed transcripts could hold clues in 1946 Moore's Ford lynching case. By Brad Scrad, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. The 1946 Moore's Ford lynching remains one of Georgia's most notorious acts of racial terror. It's always racial. Can't be just good or bad. This side or the other side. The federal grand jury met in Athens to consider the evidence collected in a massive FBI investigation. The July 25th, 1946 lynching of two young black couples, George and Mae Murray Dorsey and Roger and Dorothy Malcolm, drew national scorn to Georgia and prompted President Harry S. Truman to send the FBI to Walton County. Agents conducted close to 2,800 interviews in their effort to identify members of the mob. of as many as 20 white men who abducted and brutally shot the field hands near the Moores Ford Bridge at the Walton, Oconee County line. DPLA, August 1919. Lynching announcements from New Orleans states and Jackson Daily News reproduced in The Crisis, August 1919. The Crisis magazine was established by W.E.B. Du Bois in 1910 as the official magazine of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP. These lynching announcements from Southern newspapers were reprinted in The Crisis, accompanying a column-headed crime listing a number of recent lynchings in the South. A column-headed crime. John Hartfield will be lynched by Ellisville Mob. Remember, Ellisville Mob. Ellisville, Mississippi. John Hartfield will be lynched by Ellisville Mob at 5 o'clock this afternoon. Governor Bilbo says he is powerless to prevent it. Hattiesburg, June 26. Hattiesburg, Ellisville and Hattiesburg, Mississippi. June 26, John Hartfield, the Negro alleged to have assaulted an Ellisville young woman, has been taken to Ellisville and is guarded by officers in the office of Dr. Carter in the city. The Negro is said to have made a partial confession. We've heard the making a confession before, and we've heard how we heard what course you take in order to make a confession a result. However, we've also heard where John Hartsfield, the Negro, alleged to have assaulted an Ellisville young woman. We've also heard a Negro then assaulted a young woman, then allegedly assaulted a young woman or a young man or an old woman or an old man or a group of women or a group of men or a tourist. Think for yourself. Think about it. Think about today. A committee of Ellisville citizens has been appointed to make the necessary arrangements for the event, and the mob is pledged to act in conformity with these arrangements. Ellisville, Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Ellisville, Hattiesburg, Mississippi is where this air quotes lynching took place. Ellisville, Mississippi population in 2023. If you want to know what happened yesterday, look at today. Ellisville, Mississippi population 2023, 4,427. Ellisville, Mississippi in 2023. Ellisville demographics. According to the most recent ACS, the racial composition of Ellisville was white 53.67%, black or African American 46.03%, Asian 0.19%, Native American 0%. Whatever that means, just like whatever all the rest of these designations mean. Think for yourself. White. What does that tell you? You have no idea. Black or African American. What does that tell you? You have no idea. Asian. What does that tell you? What you term Africa, what you term Asia, what you term Europe, you can go from the northernmost point of Europe to the southernmost point of what you term Africa without crossing a body of water. So what does Asian mean? Native American. Native only means someone who was born here. So there was 0% people who were born here? I think not. Think. Look. Let's shake it. That was Ellisville. Now this is Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Hattiesburg, Mississippi population 2023, 46,657. Hattiesburg demographics. Okay, wait 1 second. Let's go back. While we talking about Ellisville and Hattiesburg, why are we talking about these two things? Because John Hartfield, the Negro alleged to have assaulted an Ellisville young woman. Okay, this is Hattiesburg. John Hartfield, the Negro. Okay. So now we're at Hattiesburg, Mississippi, population 2023, 46,657. Hattiesburg demographics. According to the most recent ACS, the racial composition of Hattiesburg was Black or African American 54.62%, White 40.38%, Asian 1.09%, Native American 0.46%. What does that tell us? That tells us that it's about half and half so-called black and so-called white in Ellisville and Hattiesburg. So, who are the people responsible for bringing homie to justice? You figure it out. You dig a little bit. Waco history. Jesse Washington lynching. Kurt Terry. Lynching of blacks became rather prevalent and reached fever pitch in the 1890s all across the United States, but mostly in the South. Lynching escalated during the 1920s, and Texas ranked third among states between the years 1885 and 1942, with approximately 468 lynchings, that is, including 339 blacks. The only states that had more lynching incidents were Mississippi and Georgia. In May 1916, Jesse Washington, a 17-year-old black teenager, was arrested for the killing of Lucy Fryer, a 53-year-old white woman. Washington would later confess to violating and killing Fryer. Wanting to avoid an attack on Washington while in custody in Waco, authorities in McLennan County, sent Washington to a Dallas jail to await his trial. Wanting to avoid an attack on Washington while in custody in Waco, authorities in McLennan County sent Washington to a Dallas jail to await his trial. A mob had gathered around the courthouse prior to the trial and waited for their chance to capture Washington. After his conviction, the jailers took Washington down the back stairs of the courthouse where the mob had been waiting. The mob of white citizens wrapped a chain around Washington's neck and dragged him to the city hall grounds, brutally stabbing and beating him as they went along. A separate mob prepared a pile of dry goods boxes, which they ignited after they poured coal oil over Washington's body. A crowd estimated to be between 15,000 to 20,000 people watched as the belligerents hung Washington from a tree and slowly lowered him up and down over the burning boxes. The mob took his body and placed it in a bag and dragged it to Robinson, Texas, which was a hometown of Fryer and a large African American population. The mob took his body and placed it in a bag and dragged it to Robinson, Texas, which was the hometown of Fryer and a large African American population. The charred and mangled body of Washington hung from a utility pole in front of a blacksmith shop until a McLennan County constable took his remains down and buried them. So the mob took his body and placed it in a bag and dragged it to Robinson, Texas, which was hometown of Fryer and a large African American population. So a mob went willingly with a so-called African American that they just did dirty and took him to his hometown with a large African American population. It's not about belief or disbelief. It's about reading the words. This is what they're saying. You think you're getting details, but you're not getting details. This is not a primary source. This is not a primary source. This is secondary at best. You think you're getting details, but does that sound right to you? I mean, does that sound logical to you? You do somebody dirty, then you take them to their hometown around their family and this and that and the third, and you're not thinking about whether or not you're going to be spotted, somebody going to see you. Let's not get into it. Let's shake it. The news of Jesse Washington's lynching received national and international coverage. Horrific pictures capturing the violence and mob were taken by local photographer Fred Gildersleeve. He profited from selling these images as postcards and prints of the lynching were distributed globally. Fred Gildersleeve sounds like every human being today recording with their freaking phone. Fred Gildersleeve was before his time. Fred Gildersleeve profited from selling images. The lynchings took place during the time of the Jim Crow laws in the South. Separate but equal had been affirmed by a 7-1 margin in the Plessy versus Ferguson case in 1896 by the Supreme Court of the United States. Separate but equal. U.S. House of Representatives. Black American members by Congress. Let's shake it. Black American members by Congress, U.S. House of Representatives. We're going to go into 1949. We're going to go up until about 1951. And we'll start about 1869. This is the segment of time that we have been told that lynchings were at their peak. Okay? Now, don't get me wrong. Putting your hands on somebody it's hard to even say, but you shouldn't be putting your hands on nobody. The main thing is that people want to be left alone. Leave people alone. See, this is the hardest concept. This is the hardest thing because from what I've noticed is that it's very difficult for everyone to leave everyone else alone. So we've learned that between roughly the 1850s and the 1950s is when most lynchings took place, and the narrative that we've been sold is that it was so-called Black Americans and or African Americans, properly Americans, that were the main victims of lynchings for no reason whatsoever. Because, these were the people who were not long before emancipated out of the Kunta Kinte, chain on the collar on the neck, chain shackled on the wrist and ankles. U.S. House of Representatives, Black American members by Congress. 1869 to 1871, Jefferson Franklin Long, Georgia Republican. 1869-1871, Joseph Hayne Rainey, South Carolina Republican. They're either in the House of Representatives or the Senate. But I'm just going to do the state that they're coming from and the party. Pay attention to the state and the party. Now, these are Black American members by Congress, properly Americans. You can look them up. You can look up their genealogy. You can do all that work. You can take any one of them and look up their genealogy, and I'm pretty sure it's, let's shake it. 1869 and 1871, Hiram Rhodes Revels, Mississippi, Republican. 1871-1873, Robert Carlos DeLarge, South Carolina Republican. 1871-1873, Robert Brown Elliott, South Carolina Republican. 1871-1873, Joseph Hayne Rainey, South Carolina Republican. 1871-1873, Benjamin Sterling Turner, Alabama Republican. 1871-1873, Josiah Thomas Walls, Florida Republican. 1873-1875, Richard Harvey Kane, South Carolina Republican. 1873-1875, Robert Brown Elliott, South Carolina Republican. 1873-1875, John Roy Lynch, Mississippi Republican. 1873-1875, Joseph Hayne Rainey, South Carolina Republican. 1873-1875, Alonzo Jacob Rancier, South Carolina Republican. 1873-1875, James Thomas Ray Pierre, Alabama, Republican. 1873, 1875, Josiah Thomas Walls, Florida, Republican. 1875, 1877, Blanche Kelso Bruce, Mississippi, Republican. 1875, 1877, Jeremiah Harrelson, Alabama, Republican. 1875, 1877, John Adams Hyman, North Carolina, Republican. 1875, 1877, John Roy Lynch, Mississippi, Republican. 1875, 1877, Charles Edmund Nash, Louisiana, Republican. 1875, 1877, Joseph Hayne Rainey, South Carolina, Republican. 1875, 1877, Robert Small, South Carolina, Republican. This is from history.house.gov. 1875, 1877, Josiah Thomas Walls, Florida, Republican. 1877, 1879, Blanche Kelso Bruce, Mississippi, Republican. 1877, 1879, Richard Harvey Kane, South Carolina, Republican. 1877, 1879, Joseph Hayne Rainey, South Carolina, Republican. 1877, 1879, Robert Small, South Carolina, Republican. 1879, 1881, Blanche Kelso Bruce, Mississippi, Republican. 1881, 1883, John Roy Lynch, Mississippi, Republican. 1881, 1883, Robert Small, South Carolina, Republican. 1883, 1885, James Edward O'Hara, North Carolina, Republican. 1883, 1885, Robert Small, South Carolina, Republican. 1883 to 1885, James Edward O'Hara, North Carolina, Republican. 1883, 1885, Robert Small, South Carolina, Republican. 1885, 1887, James Edward O'Hara, North Carolina, Republican. 1885, 1887, Robert Small, South Carolina, Republican. 1889, 1891, Henry Plummer Cheatham, North Carolina, Republican. 1889, 1891, John Mercer Langston, Virginia, Republican. 1889, 1891, Thomas Ezekiel Miller, South Carolina, Republican. 1891, 1893, Henry Plummer Cheatham, North Carolina, Republican. 1893, 1895, George Washington Murray, South Carolina, Republican. 1895, 1897, George Washington Murray, South Carolina, Republican. 1897, 1899, George Henry White, North Carolina, Republican. 1899, 1901, George Henry White, North Carolina, Republican. 1929, 1931, Oscar Stanton DePriest, Illinois, Republican. 1931, 1933, Oscar Stanton DePriest, Illinois, Republican. 1933 to 1935, Oscar Stanton DePriest, Illinois, Republican. 1935, 1937, Arthur Wergs Mitchell, Illinois, Democrat. 1937, 1939, Arthur Wergs Mitchell, Illinois, Democrat. 1939, 1941, Arthur Wergs Mitchell, Illinois, Democrat. 1941, 1943, Arthur Wergs Mitchell, Illinois, Democrat. 1943, 1945, William Levy Dawson, Illinois, Democrat. 1945, 1947, William Levy Dawson, Illinois, Democrat. 1945, 1947, Adam Clayton Jr. Powell, New York, Democrat. 1947, 1949, Dawson William Levy, Illinois, Democrat. 1947, 1949, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., Adam Clayton Powell Jr., New York, Democrat. 1949, 1951, William Levi Dawson, Illinois, Democrat. 1949 to 1951, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., New York, Democrat. See, Democrats starting at 1935. From history.house.gov. A history of African Americans and or Black Americans, properly Americans, in law enforcement. 2017, Volume 10, Issue 2. 1867, African American police officers are appointed to the police department in Selma, Alabama. 1867, African American police officers are appointed to the police department in Selma, Alabama. They would be followed in 1868 by officers in Jackson, Florida, and in 1870 by officers in Houston and Galveston, Texas. 1870, New Orleans, Louisiana has 177 African American officers, and 3 of 5 police board members were African American. April 12, 1870, Officer William Johnson of Jacksonville, Florida, became the first recognized African American police officer killed in the line of duty. 1875, Bass Reeves is appointed as the first African American deputy U.S. Marshal. cops.usdoj.gov. 1916, Georgia Ann Robinson becomes the first African American woman police officer serving in the Los Angeles Police Department. 1928, Dr. Lewis Tompkins Wright is the first known African American police surgeon. He would later become president of the NAACP Board of Directors. 1928, Dr. Lewis Tompkins Wright is the first known African American police surgeon. Maybe that should be police sergeant, but it says surgeon. He would later become president of the NAACP Board of Directors. 1941, William B. Lindsay becomes the first known African American state trooper hired by the Illinois State Police. It seems that your family was on both sides of the law. Montgomery Advertiser. Many whites were lynched for fighting racism. Richard Emanuel, Alabama Voices, 2017. If we refuse to accept facts and instead cling to preconceptions, misconceptions, and prejudice, we then choose to replace ignorance with stupidity and history with fantasy. Lynching is the unjustified settling aside of judicial due process for mob vengeance. Lynching is, by definition and by its nature, lawless. The Negro Holocaust. Lynching and race riots in the United States, 1880 through 1950. Remember, the list of, from the website, the House of Representatives, the list of Black or African American, properly American members of Congress, we took from roughly 1850 to 1950. The Negro Holocaust, lynching, and race riots in the United States, 1880 through 1950, you would think that there weren't any members of Congress that were from your family. States that, contrary to present-day popular conception, lynching was not a crime committed exclusively against Black people. Between the 1830s and 1850s, the majority of those lynched in the United States were white. Whites were the victims of more than 1/4 of all lynchings in the United States. For Blacks, most of the lynchings occurred in the South. Of the lynchings that did not take place in the South, most occurred in the West, and these were often lynchings of whites, not Blacks. 90% of whites were lynched in 9 states, mostly in a swath from Montana to Nebraska, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Texas. 90% of Blacks were lynched in the 4 southern states of Mississippi, Georgia, Texas, and Louisiana. Whites and blacks were lynched in relatively equal numbers in New York, New Jersey, Minnesota, Illinois, and Missouri. The worst year for whites was 1884, when 160 whites were lynched. For blacks, the highest number of lynchings occurred in 1892, when 161 were lynched. For blacks, the highest number of lynchings occurred in 1892, when 161 were lynched. Pick a year since you was born until now. Pick a year. Go look at the rates in which people who look like you do other people who look like you dirty in 1 year. Look at those numbers. We're not justifying anything. Look at those numbers. Let's shake it. Of the 44 states in which lynchings occurred, 23, 52% states lynched more white people than black. According to David Barton's extensively well-documented book, Setting the Record Straight, American History in Black and White, the original targets of the Ku Klux Klan were Republicans, both black and white. Republicans often led the efforts to pass federal anti-lynching laws, and their platforms Republicans often led the efforts to pass federal anti-lynching laws. Democrats successfully blocked those bills, and their platforms never did condemn lynchings. Democrats successfully blocked those bills, and their platforms never did condemn lynchings. Remember the list of Congress members, House members, and Senate members that we just read. Most of them were Republicans. This was happening 1850 to 1950 is the portion of time that I went over. Republicans, which were the majority of the people who during that time of, when lynching was at its peak, Republicans on that list from the House and the Senate, Republicans often led the efforts to pass federal anti-lynching laws. Democrats successfully blocked those bills, and their platforms never did condemn lynchings. Iowa's last lynching, the Charles City Mob of 1907, and Iowa progressivism, Michael James Pfeiffer. On January 9, 1907, a mob of several hundred men, some masked with handkerchiefs and others undisguised, rammed down the doors of Floyd County Jail in Charles City, Iowa, with a rail iron. Sheriff William Schermerhorn and several deputies offered only feeble resistance as the mob seized one of the prisoners, James Cullen, a wealthy white 62-year-old contractor. Cullen had murdered his wife and stepson the previous day. As the mob hauled Cullen to a bridge over Cedar River, Frank Roper, a Salvation Army officer, interceded to say a prayer for Cullen over the vehement protest of some of the less patient members of the mob. Cullen, at Roper's insistence, offered a prayer of his own and then reiterated that he had acted in self-defense. Approximately 500 residents of Charles City, including women and children, witnessed Cullen's hanging from the Main Street Bridge at 11:30 p.m. The lynching of James Cullen was the last mob killing in Iowa. Expressing deep frustration with what they perceived as the failure of the existing legal system to enforce justice effectively, they positioned the right of citizens who made the laws to enforce them if legal institutions failed to do so. James Cullen participated actively in the local economy, accumulating substantial personal wealth as a contractor making wooden tanks for homes and businesses. Born in Wisconsin in 1844 to parents who had immigrated from Ireland, Cullen became well known during his approximately 25 years in the community for his support for temperance and for his temper. He had business and social contacts with prominent men in Charles City and throughout Iowa, including state legislatures and other state officials. Twice married and divorced, Cullen in July 1906 married Ellen Brown Eastman, a native of neighboring Chickasaw County, who had previously operated a hotel in Fredericksburg. The Cullens soon quarreled over financial matters, with much of their argument apparently revolving around Ellen's son, 15-year-old Roy Eastman. James Cullen attacked his wife in her bed and stabbed her to death with a large knife. Richard Cullen soon James Cullen attacked his wife in her bed and stabbed her to death with a large knife. Cullen's murder of his wife and stepson marked him as a scoundrel, a menace to the community and its values. The community's resort to extra-legal measures to remove that menace indicated its temporary rejection of modern legal institutions. Let's shake it. The New York Times. From the Lynchers' Viewpoint, 1984. This is a digitized version of an article from the Times print archive before the start of online publication in 1996. To preserve these articles as they originally appeared, the Times does not alter, edit, or update them. In Julius Lester's interview with James Baldwin, May 27th, both agree that no white writer has chosen to write a novel about a lynching from the point of view of the lyncher. I suggest Saturday Afternoon by Erskine Caldwell. Saturday Afternoon, Erskine Caldwell. From the Complete Stories of Erskine Caldwell, 1941, published in American Earth. Erskine Caldwell was born in Georgia, 1903, and in his early years had varied employment and at different places in the South. This is from xroads.virginia.edu. Come on, Tom, get your gun. We're going after a nigga down the creek a ways. God almighty, Jim, Tom shouted, now fully awake. He clutched Jim's arm and begged, you going to get a nigga sure enough. You damn right, Tom. You know that gingerbread nigga that used to work on the railroad a long time back? Him's the nigga we're going to get. And we're going to get him good and proper. The yellow-faced coon. He said something to Frederick Jackson's oldest gal down the road yonder about an hour ago. Fred told us all about it over at the barber shop. Come on, Tom. We got to hurry. I expect we'll jerk him up pretty soon now. They had a place already picked out at the creek. There was a clearing in the woods by the road, and there was just enough room to do the job like it should be done. Plenty of dry brushwood nearby and a good-sized sweet gum tree in the middle of the clearing. The automobile stopped and the men jumped out in a hurry. Some others had gone for Will Maxey. Will was the gingerbread Negro. They would probably find him at home, laying his cotton by. Will could grow good cotton. He cut out all the grass first, and then he banked his rows with earth. Everybody else laid his cotton by without going to the trouble of taking out the grass. But Will was a pretty smart Negro, and he could raise a lot of corn too, to the acre. Corn, maize, to the acre. He always cut out the grass before he laid his corn by. But nobody liked Will. He made too much money by taking out the grass before laying by his cotton and corn. He made more money than Tom and Jim made in the butcher shop selling people meat. Will Maxey was coming up the big road in a hurry. A couple of dozen men were behind him poking him with sticks. Will was getting old. He had a wife and 3 grown daughters, all married and settled. Will was a pretty good Negro, too, minding his own business, stepping out of the road when he met a white man and otherwise behaving himself. But nobody liked Will. He made too much money by taking the grass out of his cotton before it was laid by. Will Maxey did not drink Coca-Cola. Will never spent his money on anything like that. That was what was wrong with him. He was too damn good for a Negro. Negro, black, colored, Indian, African American, NIGGA. He did not drink corn whiskey, nor make it. He did not carry a knife, nor a razor. Will Maxey was going up in smoke. When he was just about gone, they gave him the lead. Tom stood back and took good aim and fired away at Will with his shotgun as fast as he could breech it and put in a new load. About 40 or more of the other men had shotguns too. They filled him so full of lead that his body sagged from his neck where the trace chain held him up. National affairs. Klansmen and friends. A wish granted. Manners and morals. Americana. In Talladega, Alabama, a white hooded delegation of Ku Kluxers and a white bearded Santa Claus presented a radio to Jack Riddle, a 107-year-old Negro, and his wife. I can't see what that says. Is it Josie and his wife Joni or Josie 86 so they could hear their wish to hear the preachers? Grand Dragon Samuel Green explained that this demonstrated the heart of a Klansman. Called in photographers to take the most incongruous picture of the week. Some say these are pink and gray people, or what you term white people. In black people and or African Americans, properly Americans, that these are white people in black people uniforms or costumes, because so-called black people and so-called white people couldn't be friends, right? Let's shake it. Snopes.com. Does this photograph show a black couple accepting a gift from KKK members? Ooh. Black people accepting a gift from white people. The details behind a strange photograph taken in Alabama in 1948 remain elusive. By Arturo Garcia. This is the picture, but let's move on. Rosie Riddle. Jack and Rosie Riddle were photographed in 1948. Remember, 1850 to 1950 is when they say, lynchings were at their peak. And that's also the segment that I chose to read, the members, the so-called black members of the House and Senate, members of Congress from 1850 to 1950. Jack and Rosie Riddle were photographed in 1948 accepting a radio from a group of Ku Klux Klan members. A photograph dating from 1948 depicting an apparent show of charity on the part of the Ku Klux Klan toward an elderly black couple in Alabama. The photograph shows, let's go down, let's move along a little bit. The photograph shows 106-year-old Jack Riddle and his wife Rosie seated in front of a group of Klansmen, including one dressed as Santa Claus, flanking a radio the group had reportedly given to the couple as a gift. The image which was published in newspapers in California and Pennsylvania, among other states, has resurfaced periodically on social media platforms, although it is typically accompanied by little in the way of information about how and why the Klansmen approached the riddles with their gift. John Giggy, an associate professor of history at the University of Alabama, told us that the photograph is the type of image that Klan members would dream of at the time. This is quite a bit to unpack. I'm gonna let y'all unpack it. I don't, you know, again, it's not about believing or disbelieving. I'm gonna let y'all unpack it. I'm just reading the words and looking at the image and putting it into perspective from a human point of view. It says, although it is typically accompanied by little in the way of information about how and why the Klansmen approached the riddles with their gift. So, the Klansmen, men with uniforms on, or men with costumes on, or men covering themselves, accompanied by little in the way of information about how and why the Klansmen approached the riddles with their gift. Could the men under those uniforms, under those hoods, possibly have known the riddles? The riddles being 107 years old and such. Could have possibly known those men when they were children. Let's shake it. The given year of the image is important, 1948, as it marks the emergence of the Dixiecrats, who left the Democratic Party in 1948 over its rising interest in civil rights. In that context, the photo functions as a warning to blacks and those who would support them in their freedom struggle. The photo functions as a warning to blacks and those who would support them in their freedom struggle. So the photo in which they're giving these two so-called black elders a radio as a gift functions as a warning to blacks and those who would support them in their freedom struggle. The riddles? Freedom struggle? They're struggling for freedom? 107 years old? How many of y'all are 107 years old? How many of y'all got parents or grandparents that's 107 years old? And y'all enjoying the comforts of life. There has never been a time when all your needs have been met like today. This is 1948, and the homie Riddles, he's 107 years old. He's 107 years old and he's not in a wheelchair. He's sitting down. He's not in a wheelchair. He can stand up. That's him and his woman. He's still taking care of his woman, and she's still taking care of him. Giggy added that the photograph also screams hyperbole. You got to look up hyperbole. I've heard the word a lot of times, but I don't I can't even put it into context clues here. I don't know what the word hyperbole means right now. I'll look it up later, but maybe. Giggy added that the photograph also screams hyperbole. The idea of former slaves, here we go. We don't get any history. Wait. What does slave mean? Slave means worker, laborer, employee. The idea of former workers, laborers, people who obviously labored for themselves and are still laboring for themselves, the idea of former slaves sitting with Klansmen seems to at least suggest a mockery of Klan pretensions of power and acceptance. Time magazine also published a brief item about the pictured meeting on January 3rd, 1949, under the heading Manners and Morals. In Talladega, Alabama, a white hooded delegation of Ku Kluxers and a white bearded Santa Claus presented a radio to Jack Riddle, a 107-year-old Negro, and his wife, Josie, 86, so they could have their wish to hear the preachers. This is the picture. A separate photograph of the encounter was collected in the book From the Picture Press, published by the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1973. So, Jack Riddle, if you some kin to Jack Riddle and Josie Riddle, put a comment in the comment section. Cause I want to know why y'all don't got this newspaper article and this photo, and the Museum of Modern Art in New York got it. Y'all should have it. Here's the picture. It's kind of vague. It's not really all that clear. But you see. You see. I mean, what y'all got to say about it? Do they look like they scared of these men? Do they look like they're wearing costumes, Halloween costumes of so-called black people? And if they wearing Halloween costumes, where Party City? And are the men sincere? The Ku Kluxers, are they sincere? Well, you can't tell because they got on hoods. So you don't know. This is the other picture. A brief op-ed attributed to the Milwaukee Journal newspapers on 26 December 1948. Because the Klan's professions and practices vary so much, we suggest the Northerners maintain a healthy skepticism about any regeneration of the Klan. It will take more than pretty words and a few gifts to Negroes to wipe out the record of terror, intimidation, and violence that has been synonymous with the name Klan. If you want to know about what was happening yesterday, look at today. Look at what I just read, this paragraph that I just read. No matter what you think, the author of this article and their boss, a brief op-ed attributed to the Milwaukee Journal newspaper. The Milwaukee Journal newspaper. They're going to give you what to think. They're going to think for you. Because the Klan's professions and practices vary so much, we suggest that Northerners maintain a healthy skepticism about any regeneration of the Klan. It will take more than pretty words and a few gifts to Negroes. It'll take more than a few pretty words and a few gifts to Negroes to wipe out the record of terror, intimidation, and violence that has been synonymous with the name Klan. And in this record of terror, intimidation, and violence by the Klan, who are the Klan? I mean, they got on masks. Who are they? It's like today seeing people with surgical masks on and hoodies, and all you see is their eyes. Who are they? Who are those people? With the record of terror, intimidation, and violence. Who using pretty words and giving gifts to Negroes? Who gives gifts to Negroes? What disgusting human being gives gifts to Negroes? Let's just, how about for this second, we just acknowledge the act. And as for that radio gift to Jack Riddle, the Klan's goodwill toward the Negro will be more convincing when it is concerned with the welfare, the education, and the civil rights of all Negroes. And as far, is this not today? Is this not right now? And as for that radio gift to Jack Riddle, the Klan's goodwill toward the Negro will be more convincing when it is concerned with the welfare, the education, and the civil rights of all Negroes. And as far as that radio gift to Jack Riddle, the Klan's goodwill toward the Negro, or the daddy to the Negro, when the Klan is concerned with the welfare, education, and civil rights of all Negroes? All Negroes ain't concerned with the welfare, the education, and the civil rights of Negroes. See, this is the issue. Monolith. Groupthink. I'm as different. A so-called white person is as different from me as he is from his own cousin. I'm as different from my own cousin as I am from any so-called white person. We not the same. And as for the radio gift to Jack Riddle, the Klan's goodwill toward Negro will be more convincing when it is concerned with the welfare, the education, and the civil rights of all Negroes. So the gift didn't mean spit. The gift of the radio didn't mean Nathan to these people. It meant nothing that he gave him and his wife the radio as a gift, which was a big deal in 1948. They wanted to hear the preachers. Like you go hear the preacher on Sunday. They wanted to hear the preachers. So they gave them a gift. And they gave them a thought. They was thoughtful in their gift giving. They gave them something they wanted. How many of y'all get some on Christmas that y'all don't want? Because the person who gave it to you, they didn't really know what you liked. And you took it back. Or you just put it in the pile with the rest of the stuff. But the people, the Klan who gave them the gift, The gift didn't mean anything because they wasn't concerned with the welfare, the education, and the civil rights of the Riddles. Just giving them a gift wasn't enough. For the Milwaukee Journal, for the newspaper, for the critics. The problem of Jack Riddle not having a radio set is only a very small part of the overall picture of the Negro in the South. The picture that's being painted by somebody who is not him. This is the picture of 107-year-old Jack Riddle holding his own, 107 years old, out there in the dark, Alabama in the forest. Yeah. According to an obituary published in Jet magazine in January 1953, Jack Riddle died at the age of 111. Let's go back up for a second. History Today. A hidden chapter. Women of the Klan. The role of women in the Ku Klux Klan is often neglected, but they were key players at all levels. Rachel Gillett. Whoa, 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 what is this? Wait, whoa, 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 whoa. This is a black and white photo, I know. Whoa, 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 whoa. This is a black and white photo, I know. But look at the hands on these people. Look at the necks they're showing. To the person at the far left standing straight forward, we see that neck is a little light. A little light. It could be a pink or gray woman. It is a little light. But the woman all the way to the right, that neck is a little darker. And then the one holding the little child, I'm going to just say it's a little girl looking at the sandals and the socks. Although today you wouldn't be able to say, but I'm going to just say it's a little girl by looking at the sandals and the socks. But look at the hands clamping together holding that little girl. Those hands really don't look like the hands of a pink or gray woman, man. I don't know. I don't believe or disbelieve. I don't know. I don't know. I'm just looking at this photo, this black and white photo. I clearly see the white robes and they patches are black. And the setting, the it's nighttime. You can see the darkness in the background. But I'm looking at the necks of these people, the legs of this little girl, I presume little girl, the hands of the woman that's holding this little girl. I don't know. Y'all tell me. Y'all tell me what y'all think. The comment section is open. Say what you think. The Ku Klux Klan has entered popular memory as sometimes menacing, sometimes almost comical group of angry men clad in white robes with hooded faces setting crosses alight or thundering through Reconstruction-era American towns on horseback. This image, however, fails to convey just how deeply women contributed to the work of the KKK. Oklahoma Historical Society. Ku Klux Klan, the Encyclopedia of Oklahoma, History and Culture. Ku Klux Klan. Initially, the Klan had emerged from the confusion of Reconstruction in the Deep South. In the 1915 movie Birth of a Nation, D.W. Griffith characterized the KKK as the savior of the Reconstruction South from evil carpetbaggers and the stereotypical African American. In 1866, Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest had reportedly formed the original Klan in Tennessee. The first Klan grew rapidly. However, the first Klan grew rapidly, having 550,000 members by 1869. The group focused on African Americans as people. The group, the first Klan grew rapidly, having 550,000 members by 1869. The group focused on African Americans as people and not as lawbreakers. The first Klan grew rapidly, having 550,000 members in 1869. The group focused on African Americans as people and not as lawbreakers. In 1869, General Forrest disbanded the Knights, claiming that undesirables within the fraternity had perverted its ideals and were driving out the better members. The second coming of the Ku Klux Klan originated in Georgia in 1915. The founder, William Joseph Simmons, possessed great oratorical skills but lacked organizational abilities. In 1920, Simmons partnered with the Southern Publicity Association of Atlanta, and Klan membership soared to 100,000 in 18 months. The Klan became the community watchdog, and when a citizen did not exemplify the Kluxers' moral standards, a midnight whipping party flogged the offender. Local law officers sometimes handed criminals over to the Klan and occasionally participated in the punishment. The Klan also targeted European immigrants, American Indians, Jews, Catholics, and religious groups. On the whole, however, Oklahoma Kluxers directed most of their attention to white Protestants who had gone astray. The Klan's power peaked in the 1920s. In 1923, the Klan built Benno Hall, an enormous $200,000 building that dominated downtown Tulsa. In 1923, the Klan built Benno Hall, an enormous $200,000 building that dominated downtown Tulsa. The organization also played a primary role in Governor John C. Walton's 1923 impeachment. Appalled by constant violence attributed to the Klan, Walton put parts of Oklahoma under martial law, starting with Okmulgee County or Okmulgee County, then Tulsa, and eventually the entire state. This is from Culture Vultures. Map of Chicago gangs. Full tour of Chicago hoods. Chicago gangs map key. Red equals Black P Stones, dark blue Gangster Disciples, light blue Black and Maniac Latin Disciples, green Mickey Cobras and Spanish Cobras, gold Vice Lords and Latin Kings. South Side. Originally, the South Side was a place for the city's white population, but after urban renewal of the city's historic black community of Bronzeville, or known locally as the Low End, With the placement of housing projects and the Dan Ryan, Interstate 90, Interstate 94, thousands of residents were displaced into the South Side during the 1960s and 70s. The black community began to expand first into neighborhoods like Inglewood and Back of the Yards, then followed by communities like Auburn, Gresham, 95th Street, and Roseland and West Pullman, which both will become known as the Wild Hunnets, an area that became a hotbed for Chicago gangs. In Inglewood, the Gangster Disciples were created on South Green as the Supreme Gangsters. The Back of the Yards neighborhood once consisted of all white and mixed gangs, like the Gaylords and the Renegade Saints, while in the South Side Chicago hoods along 83rd, 87th, and 95th Streets, the Black P Stones have had a dominant presence since the 1970s. West Side. From the Vice Lords to Gangster Disciples to the Four Corner Hustlers to the New Breeds and the Black Souls, the West Side might not have received the recognition from the media as the South Side, but within the streets of the Chicago ghetto, there is little difference between either side, as this section of the city is the birthplace of numerous Chicago gangs. Starting along Madison and East Garfield Park, the community would eventually make its way into North Lawndale and West Garfield Park, followed by the Austin neighborhood by the 1970s and 1980s. Chicago gangs of the West Side date back to the 1950s and 60s. Gangs were originally created for needed protection from other races, as the newly arrived African Americans were constantly abused and mistreated. But would later become involved in local politics and efforts to better the community. One of the largest gangs in the country are the Vice Lords, who originally began during the 1950s in Illinois juvenile facilities before starting their foundation in North Lawndale. East Side. From state to the lake, the saying that refers to the east side of Chicago, meaning the boundaries of East Side expand from State Street to Lake Michigan. There are multiple Chicago gangs on the East Side, like the Gangster Disciples, Folk on the Hustlers, Black Disciples, and various Vice Lord factions. But the most known has been the Almighty Black P Stone Nation. On the corner of 67th and Blackstone, the Almighty Black P Stone Nation began as the Blackstone Rangers in the Woodlawn neighborhood. The growth of the Black P Stone also led to spin-off gangs like the Titanic Stones, Maniac Stones, or Mickey Cobras. Outside of the Black P Stones, Chicago gangs of the Gangster Disciples and the Black Disciples, who started out as the Devil Disciples around 53rd and Woodlawn, hold much of a presence on the city's east side, especially around King Drive, Cottage Grove, and in South Shore. North Side. From Cabrini Green and Marshall Field to the sections of the city known as the North Pole, there are numerous Hispanic and Black Chicago gangs and hoods on the North Side. The section of the North Side that is known as the North Pole, from Rogers Park to the Uptown neighborhood, is a large, diverse community of African Americans and Latinos who have been either displaced from or relocated from other Chicago neighborhoods and have been making their way into the far North Side since the 70s and 80s, 1970s and 1980s. Latino community. With prominent Latino Chicago gangs of the Latin Kings, Satan Disciples, Maniac Latin Disciples, Spanish Cobras, and Gangsta 2-6, the Hispanic community of both Mexicans and Puerto Ricans have many similarities to the city's black population. The Mexican community began in the Pilsen and back of the yards neighborhoods after relocating into Chicago as early as the 1910s. Urban renewal in Pilsen and the closing of the stockyards in the back of the yards neighborhood led the Latino population to expand into Little Village and Cicero by the 1960s and 1970s, and continuing into areas like Gage Park by the 1980s. In Pilsen, there were gangs like the Ambrose, the Bishops, the Satan Disciples, and the La Raza. While in Little Village, the first and largest gang was the Gangster 2-6, who gained members due to their dislike toward the Latin Kings, who came from other sections of the city. During the 1950s, Puerto Ricans began to arrive in the city of Chicago. During the 1950s, Puerto Ricans began to arrive in the city of Chicago. Most resided in Humboldt Park, with Division Street being the heart of the neighborhood. As more and more Puerto Ricans arrived, the population expanded to over 100,000 by the 1980s into neighborhoods like Logan Square, Belmont, Cragen, and Hermosa. This eventually created the Latin Kings on Spalding Avenue, the Maniac Latin Disciples around North Rockwell, the Spanish Cobras along Campbell Avenue, and the Insane Albany Orchestra and the Imperial Gangsters in the Logan Square area. Ida B. Wells Homes, Chicago Gang History. 37th Street on the north, Pershing Road on the south, Cottage Grove Avenue on the east, Martin Luther King Drive on the west. 1939 through 1941, construction. 2000 through 2011, demolition. Gangster Disciples, Black Pea Stones. The original name of the projects was to be the South Parkway Garden Homes, but before construction, it was renamed the Ida B. Wells Homes in June of 1939. Ground was broken in June of 1939 to begin the construction of this development, but then by July, the construction was halted due to white business owners in the neighborhood filing injunctions to try to stop the construction because it was felt that it would negatively affect their businesses. Once that was overthrown, there was a labor strike at the site because the cheaper way of making the buildings was causing job cuts to occur. But finally, in late October, construction went about again. Applicants for the projects were carefully screened by Elizabeth Wood and her staff to make sure they were moving in good families, as they did not want criminals or other undesirables. The first residents in the Ida B. Wells projects were mainly two-parent families, and most residents held down jobs, and residents did not have any criminal past. The community in these projects was tight-knit, and children played outside without worry. The main street gang that ran these projects in the 1940s, 1950s, and early 1960s was the Deacons, but they did not destroy the community or the projects. It was not until more violent and more predatory gangs arrived in the mid to late 1960s that drugs and murderous gang activity began to happen. Gangs such as Black Pea Stones and Black Disciples arrived and flushed the Deacons out. In the 1970s, maintenance of the projects began to slow down as the gang problems with Black Pea Stones and Black Gangster Disciples worsened. Another issue in these projects was drug addiction. that was becoming worse as Stones and disciples sold heroin to the community in these buildings. By the late 1970s, CHA could no longer budget repairs and renovations. In the 1980s and 1990s, these projects were severely deteriorated and full of transient drug addicts and criminals, making the projects extremely unsafe. And the police did very light patrols, if any at all. Guns blazed all around this complex on a daily basis as Stones and disciples killed each other over drug turf. Since the 1970s, the CHA no longer screened applicants closely and worked on a first come, first served basis, which brought in many residents with criminal and drug addiction backgrounds. Since the 1970s, the CHA no longer screened applicants closely and worked on a first come, first served basis, which brought in many residents with criminal and drug addiction backgrounds. In the year 2000, the Ida B. Wells were condemned and deemed inhumane. Residents began being ordered to evacuate while the buildings began the process of demolition. By 2009, all the Ida B. Wells were vacated, and by 2011, the last buildings were torn down. Bill of Rights Institute, Ida B. Wells and the campaign against lynching. Natural. Written by Bill of Rights Institute. The whole institute wrote it together at the same time. In March 1892 in Memphis, Tennessee, the city had just built the first bridge across the Mississippi south of the Ohio River to attract the railroad and enhance commerce. A racially mixed group of boys was gambling at a local general store for white patrons when tensions flared and a father of one of the white boys whipped the black child. The owner of the general store, W.H. Barrett, went to a nearby competing grocery and violently confronted an African-American clerk named Calvin McDowell and pistol whipped him. McDowell fought back and bloodied Barrett. A white judge issued an arrest warrant for McDowell. Deputies led a white mob to serve the warrant and confronted a large band of armed black men at the grocery store. Shots were fired and 3 deputies and some of the civilians were wounded in the exchange of gunfire. The deputies took a dozen African Americans into custody. Angry whites rounded up dozens more African American men while ransacking their homes. Because of the common practice in the South of white mobs seizing black men in jail and murdering them, the African American Tennessee Rifle State Militia, the African American Tennessee Rifles State Militia Company surrounded the jail. They had to depart, however, when a white judge ordered them disarmed. You don't hear about this stuff. Because of the common practice in the South of white mobs seizing black men in jail and murdering them, the African American Tennessee Rifle State Militia Company surrounded the jail. They had to depart, however, when a white judge ordered them disarmed. In the middle of the night, a white mob descended upon the jail and dragged out McDowell and 2 other black men named Thomas Moss and Will Stewart. All 3 were taken to a field where they were shot. Their bodies were mutilated and they were left to rot. No indictments were issued for the murders. Among the outraged African Americans who lived in Memphis at the time was journalist Ida B. Wells, who was in New York when the murders occurred. She had been born in 1862 during the Civil War, and afterward, her family became active in the Republican Party. Wells had been a close friend of Tom Moss and was infuriated by the senseless murders. When Wells had been a close friend of Tom Moss and was infuriated by the senseless murders. Senseless murders, maybe, but the confrontation happened. When she returned to Memphis, she penned an inflammatory editorial in the local newspaper, the Free Press, that confronted whites directly about lynching. Ida B. Wells penned an inflammatory editorial in the local newspaper. She penned that in a local newspaper, and it got out. People read it. Think for yourself. Think for yourself. Don't be lazy. Don't be lazy. In the editorial, she wrote, "This is what opened my eyes to what lynching really was, an excuse to get rid of Negroes who were acquiring wealth and property and thus keep the race terrorized." I, I I'm not sure how Ida B came to that conclusion based on that confrontation that I just read. You can go back, y'all can go back and read the confrontation that I read and see if it justifies it, if her response justifies it. But she sounds very familiar to things that you hear today. She exploded the myth that lynchings were carried out in retribution for black men raping white women because the overwhelming majority of sexual relationships were consensual or merely a product of fear in white imaginations. This article is all over the place. I thought we was talking about the confrontation homie them had with homie them. Now we talking about black men, white women, and this and that and the third. Let's shake it. Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in all its phases. Ida B. New York, 1892. In 1898, Wells went to Washington, D.C. to implore President William McKinley to institute reforms against lynching and discrimination. She's moving around. She became a co-founder of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Ida B. Natural. Natural. American. American. Original American. I mean, look at it, please, man. I mean, we ain't gonna do the how people look thing, but we gonna do the how people look thing. Organized crime in California, 2009. Annual report to the legislature. Edmund G. Brown, Jr., Attorney General. California Department of Justice, Division of Law Enforcement, Bureau of Investigation and Intelligence. The California Department of Justice has found that criminal street gangs continue to engage in drug trafficking. They are also involved in auto theft, weapons trafficking, intimidation, extortion, assault, and murder. Street gang members use social networking websites to communicate. The Sureños and Norteños comprise the largest number of street gang members in California. Norteño's gang members are engaged in drug trafficking, carjacking, home invasions, robbery, assault, and homicide. Norteño's gang members engage in drug trafficking, extortion, carjacking, home invasion, robbery, assault, and homicide. The Norteños and Sureños rivalry reached a peak during 2009 in Salinas with 29 gang-related murders. MS-13 gang members engage in drug smuggling and trafficking, alien smuggling, assault, drive-by shootings, homicide, identity theft, prostitution operations, robbery, and weapons trafficking. The Fresno Bulldogs is one of the largest criminal street gangs independent of the Norteños and Sureños. They also engage in assault, burglary, homicide, and robbery. African American street gangs are divided mostly between two rival groups, the Crips and the Bloods. American street gang criminal activities include armed robbery, assault, burglary, gun trafficking, carjacking, drug sales, home invasions, identity theft, murder, prostitution, including the use of children, and violations. African American street gangs use weapons including handguns, assault rifles, and knives. American street gang members monitor and leverage evolving communication technologies. They actively use internet social networking sites. These internet venues often convey intimidating and disrespectful messages and videos to rival gangs. The Complex History of the Crips and Bloods Rivalry, David McNew, by Elizabeth Collins, South Central Los Angeles in the 1950s. The majority of the population was black. The creation of street gangs in the 1960s as a way for young black men to protect their communities. The majority of the population was black. The creation of street gangs in the 1960s as a way for young black men to protect their communities, even though the majority of the population was black. One night in 1972, after a Curtis Mayfield concert, members of the Crips murdered Robert Ballou Jr. for not giving them his leather jacket. Between 1972 and 1979, the rivalry between Crips and Bloods would grow, accounting for a majority of the approximately 450 gang-related murders in South Los Angeles. Factions of the Crip-on-Crip warfare have become a norm. The introduction of The introduction of rocks raised the stakes in gang activity, and by the year 1980, the murder rate increased by some 50%. According to a 1989 Washington Post article, LA gang members moved into new towns, recruited and ran drugs from Los Angeles to as far as Baltimore. Mara Salvatrucha is one of the most famous American gangs. MS-13 is a brutal, violent gang. As reported by USA Today, MS-13 has established a reputation for flagrant brutality, including hacking people to death with machetes, executing people in broad daylight in front of witnesses, and beating people to death with baseball bats. They've also been known to brutalize the dead bodies of their victims. Born out of a wave of immigration from El Salvador, eventually immigrants from other countries like Honduras and Mexico joined. According to Law Library, the first murder associated with the Crips occurred in 1972. By the end of that year, there were 28 more in Los Angeles. And by 1980, the Crips were involved in 355 deaths in the city, as reported by Time between 1988 and 1992. Gang-related homicides rose by an astounding 77% as Los Angeles gangs perfected violent tactics like the drive-by shooting. According to the FBI, the Bloods have evolved into quite the horrifying criminal organization involved in activities including human trafficking, drug dealing, loan sharking, and murder. According to the Long Beach Post, virulently racist white supremacist gang Public Enemy Number One, often condensed to Pen One, has the distinction of being the nation's first hybrid gang operating parallel street and prison organizations. Public Enemy Number One began as a part of the California punk scene, which included a subset of skinhead groups that became increasingly racist and violent during the 1980s and 1990s. Public Enemy Number One makes its money from drug dealing, but its members have committed just about every violent crime out there, including assault and murder. The Herald News reports that the almighty Latin King nation, usually shortened to just the Latin Kings, was officially formed in 1960 Chicago. Its original purpose was to give a collective voice to the Spanish-speaking immigrants in the U.S., empowering them to chase the American dream. By the 1990s, had established a policy called Anybody Killer, that more or less declared violent war on anyone that got in their way, which often included gangs allied with them. They're as dangerous as ever. How New York gang culture is changing. Seth Ferranti, 2015. Vice reached out to renowned New York State gang expert Ron Cook Barrett and Kevin Deutsch, the award-winning Newsday crime reporter and author of The Triangle, A Year on the Ground with New York's Bloods and Crips. What are some of the biggest gangs in New York today? The biggest gangs in New York are obviously influenced by the Department of Corrections and filter to the streets. Traditionally, since 1993, the Bloods have been the power within Rikers Island and many state correctional facilities. Sets like the Mac Ballers, G-Shine Brims, and Gorilla Brims have been active and constantly fight for control of facilities. There are Crip sets, Latin Kings, Trinitarios, Gangsta Disciples, MS-13, and others active. Every nationality is represented within the gang culture. The biggest trend in New York State has been the influence of hybrid gangs. They represent local housing projects, parks, city blocks, and streets. Buffalo, Syracuse, Albany, Newburgh, Poughkeepsie, and obviously the boroughs of New York all have a heavy presence of local territorial hybrid gangs. Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, Mount Vernon, Washington Heights, they all are seeing a rise in hybrid gangs that are not connected to the traditional super gangs, Bloods, Crips, Kings, etc. Gangs have replaced the traditional family. Residents generally say their impact is overwhelmingly negative. Those not affiliated with the gang generally see less economic opportunity due to the gang's presence in their neighborhoods. Open air drug markets, the cornerstone of New York's urban underworld economy, drive away law, abiding small business owners and entrepreneurs searching for new properties. They also hurt sales at existing neighborhood businesses, putting a tremendous strain on local economies. Schools in the community also suffer. The larger presence a gang has in a given community, the lower the graduation rate will be at local schools. A high percentage of the shootings in urban communities are connected to drug gangs fighting over territory and turf wars. In my reporting, I found that this particular set and others used violating women as a weapon to control civilian populations in territories they control, not unlike occupying armies. An enemy gangster's girlfriend or sister might be assaulted. The Baltimore Sun. Homicide is a devastating plague on black communities, and it is time we stop ignoring it. John Hudgens. The Baltimore Sun. The Baltimore Sun. When Hillary Clinton ran for president nearly 4 years ago, she was forced to apologize for once saying there were predators in the black community. ... Question mark. Of the more than 300 people killed in the streets of Baltimore last year, just about all of them were African Americans. The killers were most likely black as well. This is a devastating plague acutely affecting black communities across the country. And understand, when we're saying black and we're naming these gangs, just understand this. From the northernmost part of Canada to the southernmost part of South America, and all the islands, Jamaica, Cuba, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Barbados, all these islands, all the Americas. This is what we're talking about. All the Americas. We're talking about the original people of this earth soil portion, from the northernmost part of Canada to the southernmost part of South America, and all the islands in close proximity. We must realize that some black people are a much greater threat to other black people than the Ku Klux Klan. The number of... This is an article. I didn't write this. Let's shake it. We must realize that some black people are a much greater threat to other black people than the Ku Klux Klan. The number of blacks gunned down in the streets by other blacks parallels our memories of the many blacks lynched in communities across the United States. Again, it is mostly black victims. Look, don't let me take your mind off what I just read. It's just that saying black so many times, it's very hard to do. People who look like us have been called many things. You have been called black, you have been called white, you have been called mulatto, you have been called mixed, you have been called colored, you have been called African American, American Indian, you've been called so many different things. All of this is lazy. All the people who write these articles, all these articles that where you see, look, this is one paragraph. This is roughly a paragraph. And I don't even want to count how many times you see the word black. Don't let me throw you off. Don't let me get, I don't want to get off task, but understand this is very difficult because it almost seems that like I'm being lazy by continuing to say black instead of making it really clear that we have no idea who these people are. Just like when a person sees me and if they call me black or African American, it's very lazy. They have no idea who I am. They have no idea what my second, third, fourth, fifth great grandparents called themselves. And you look at these articles and they don't ask. Let's shake it. Here we go again. Many African American communities are under siege by black gun toting terrorists. Children cannot play in their yards, and the elderly can no longer sit on their porches. Office of Attorney General of Georgia, Chris Carr. In America, nearly half of all violent crimes are gang related. Georgia, with 71,000 validated gang affiliates and over 1,500 suspected gang networks across the state. This is from law.georgia.gov. This is from Prison Writers, All About Gangs in Florida, from a Lifer Who's Seen It All by Charles Norman. I have survived over 36 years in Florida's worst prisons without compromising my principles. I've learned a lot about gangs without even trying. Florida, in the past 20 years, the police claim over 150 prison gangs operate in Hillsborough County, Tampa alone. The largest and most well-known prison gangs in Florida are Latin Kings, Folk Nation, Gangsta Disciples, Crips, Bloods, MS-13, Mexican Mafia, the Outlaws Biker Gang, and unnamed white groups. Puerto Ricans, Cubans, and Mexicans would hang together in their individual groups, but they weren't organized like today. Black prisoners separated themselves mostly by their hometowns: Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Palm Beach, Tampa, St. Pete, Orlando, Jacksonville, and Pensacola. Jamaicans and other islanders kept to themselves. Texas gangs. Houston area regional gangs: 18th Street, 52nd Hoover Crips, Southeast 52nd Hoovers, 59th Bounty Hunters, 59th Piru, 5th Ward Circle, Aryan Brotherhood, Aryan Circle. This is from StopHoustonGangs.org. Austin Tango Blast, Bandidos, Barrio Azteca, Bloods, Crips, Dallas Tango Blast, D-Town, Fort Worth Tango Blast, Fortitos, Hermanos, Pistoleros, Latinos, Houston Tango Blast, La Primera, Latin Disciples, Latin Kings, Los Zeta, Mexican Mafia, MS-13, Raza Unida, Rio Grande Valley Tango Blast, San Antonio Tango Blast, Orejones, Southwest Cholos, Texas Mexican Mafia, Texas Syndicate, Treetop Bloods, Hilltop Bloods, West Tango. The Pointer Institute. Philip Van Cleve stated on December 9, 2019 in a speech, U.S. and Virginia murders are usually gangbangers killing gangbangers. Warren Fisk, 2020, are most murders gangbangers killing gangbangers, as Van Cleve says. Van Cleve, in a speech at the rally, said Democrats should focus on stopping crime instead of restricting guns. He blamed gun violence mostly on gangs. It's usually gangbangers killing gangbangers. The National Gang Center under the Department of Justice. Based on annual surveys of local law enforcement agencies, the center tallied 11,934 gang-related homicides in the U.S. from 2007 through 2012. The FBI reported 93,253 total murders during the span. Comparing the numbers, the center estimated that gang-related homicides typically accounted for around 13% of all homicides annually. That's far below Van Cleve's claim that most murders are gang-related. The center tallied 1,975 gang-related murders in 2007 and 2,363 in 2012, a 24% increase. Van Cleve noted there are high murder rates in some cities where gangs are prevalent. The National Gang Center estimated that from 2007 through 2012, 13% of U.S. homicides were gang related, but it stopped collecting the data after that. Let's shake it. Haitian residents lynch and set fire to suspected gang members. Haitian residents lynch and set fire to suspected gang members. This is from NBCnews.com. This is April 2023. Haitian police said on Monday that at least 10 suspected gang members had been lynched and their bodies burned by residents of Port-au-Prince. Photos by Reuters and video circulating on social media show several bodies piled in the road with smoking tires and other objects on top of them. People surround them, shouting angrily. One person can be seen beating the lifeless bodies with a blunt object. Again, NBCnews.com. Bloody turf battles have left hundreds dead and thousands displaced. What if pink and gray people who you term as white people. You know, some of y'all say white people because y'all too lazy to ask these so-called white people where they second, third, or fourth great grandparents are from. What if the pink and gray people, the so-called white people, mobbed up to protect themselves from an NIGGA like you? And what if some of the people you term white people and some of the people you term black Americans and or African Americans, properly Americans, got together and formed mobs to protect themselves from NIGGAs like you? I know. That's impossible, right? Because some so-called white people and some so-called black people couldn't have possibly been friends. Do the right thing.